Hey rePROs, whenever anything is happening in the courts, especially when it comes to reproductive rights and social justice, I immediately turn to the Boom Lawyered podcast by Rewire News Group to help me understand what just happened, but also the greater impact. Hosted by the amazing Amanda Gandy and Jess Pieklo, Boom Lawyered brings us some humanity and humor to the law at a time when we need it the most. You can find Boom Lawyered on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome to rePROs Fight Back, a podcast on all things related to sexual and reproductive health rights and justice. Hi rePROs, how's everybody doing? I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and my pronouns are she, her. So y'all, it is officially sweaty, sticky season in DC, and I am not a fan. I'm especially not a fan because when I record the podcast, I have to close all my windows so you don't hear anything that's happening outside. And I have to turn off my AC so that you can't hear the fan running if it runs. And that means I just sit here and roast. There's a sunlight, depending on the time of day, but today when I was recording, there was like sunlight directly where I was sitting. So it was just like slowly getting hotter and hotter as we were having this conversation, and it was making it a little hard to focus, but that's okay. It was still a great conversation. Don't worry, y'all. I made sure that we had a good conversation, but yeah, not a fan. And adding on top of that, as it has gotten warm, for some reason, all of a sudden this week, Luna is like, hey, I need to snuggle with your arm while you're working. And I know you're hot and sticky and gross, but I'm just going to lay my entire kitty body all down the length of your arm and use your hand for a pillow. Thanks. So not a fan. She's lucky she's cute. But yeah, I don't need kitty snuggles while I'm working and while I'm hot. Like, thanks, Luna. Otherwise, I feel like there's just so much happening and so many terrible things to keep track of, whether that is the reconciliation bill or this new rescissions package, which is looking to claw back a bunch of money from foreign assistance, particularly from global health and public broadcasting, and yeah, just a lot. And there was what is happening in Los Angeles. There are the many ICE raids that feel like they've been going on for forever. And there's just so many terrible things. And I'm recording this on Wednesday, June 11th. So before the big military parade in DC this weekend. So got that to look forward to. And by that, I mean, I am staying in my condo all day and not going outside. I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want to be near it. I don't want to deal with it. I'm sure I'll hear all of the helicopters and if there's planes and stuff flying overhead. But yeah, I don't want anything to do with any of it. And I feel like it's back to that time where I've been trying to be really good about not being on social media a lot, to not get caught up in what the new latest outrage is, but there are so many like legit terrible things happening that it's hard to keep up and it's overwhelming. And I know that's the point, right? Is to have so many things happening that you can't focus on any one of them, and it makes it harder to push back. The point is to overwhelm us. And unfortunately for me at the moment, it seems to be working. Like I'm losing my outrage capacity at the moment. Like I still have like that flash, like right when it happens, but I can't stay focused on it because there's like the new outrage like 10 minutes later. So I'm trying to find my peace again so that way I can more effectively fight back in the many ways that I try to fight back. So yeah, I'm just feeling a little overwhelmed right now by all of the things. And like I said, there's just so much happening that it is making it hard to focus on any one of them. Yeah, sorry to be a little bit of a bummer today, y'all. Let's go back to kitties, right? Let's go back to Luna deciding it is okay to need to snuggle with my arm when it is 90 degrees and I am hot and gross. Okay, actually. Let's just turn to this week's interview. I feel like there's a lot going on and I could talk about any number of them. But again, my brain is like scattered and having a hard time focusing on any one of the terribles. So let's just talk about this week's episode instead. I'm excited. This is the next in our series on abortion later in pregnancy. I am so very grateful to Patient Forward for helping me put this series together, in particular Banyan, who has been so helpful in helping me outline the series and find guests and really helping put this all together. I am very excited for this whole series. If you haven't heard the first 2 episodes, we'll make sure to link them in our show notes so that way you can listen to all parts of it, because I think it's a really important conversation. And today we're going to talk about, again, abortions later in pregnancy, but we're also going to be talking about an effort in Massachusetts to try and repeal their state's gestational ban. And joining me, I am very excited to have Kate Dineen, a patient advocate and a Reproductive Equity Now board member in Massachusetts who's working to repeal that viability ban, and Jeanette Kincaid, who's the Associate Director of Care Coordination at the DuPont Clinic. I am really excited for our conversation, so let's go to my interview with Jeanette and Kate. Hi, Kate and Jeanette. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hello.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So before we get into our conversation, why don't I have y'all introduce yourselves? Jeanette, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Jeanette Kincaid. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Associate Director of Care Coordination at DuPont Clinic in Washington, D.C. DuPont Clinic is one of a few all-trimester abortion clinics in the country, and we see patients from Massachusetts as well as from all over the United States and all over the world.
Kate, do you want to go?
Hi, my name is Kate Dineen, and I am a later abortion patient and advocate, and I am based in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm also a board member of an organization called Reproductive Equity Now, and we work at the state level in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire with a focus on expanding access to abortion care throughout pregnancy.
I am so excited to have both of you on. This is going to be our 3rd episode in a 6-part series on abortion later in pregnancy. And I'm excited because this is like a little bit of a good news episode, which is fun. I feel like I don't get to do those a ton, to hear about some new fights that are happening. So, but before we get there, maybe, Kate, let's start with how you got involved in this work. I think it's always helpful to hear people's personal stories to make sure that people understand what is at stake when we're talking about abortion later in pregnancy.
Great. Well, thank you so much for creating this space. So I got involved in this movement in a very personal way. So back in July of 2021, I was about 32 weeks into a meticulously planned and deeply wanted pregnancy when I went in for what I thought was a routine ultrasound. And the ultrasound tech detected something called ventriculomegaly in my son Teddy's brain. And that led to a whole series of, completely devastating and unexpected next steps. I had a fetal MRI right after that ultrasound, and the MRI detected that my son had suffered a catastrophic stroke in utero, and he would either die in utero or survive with a spectrum of potentially devastating outcomes. The pediatric neurologist couldn't fully explain what those outcomes would be, so it's often described as a gray diagnosis, but the prognosis for me and my husband was so devastating that I immediately asked, what are my options? And I was standing in my kitchen in Boston on a Zoom, because this was during the pandemic, and I will never forget the response. I was told, you may still be able to explore termination if you're able to travel. So in that moment, I was just so shocked and confused. obviously still processing the very unexpected and devastating fetal diagnosis. But I thought to myself, travel where? I live in Boston, which up until then I had thought to be this bastion of reproductive justice. I've always been very pro-choice and supportive of the statutory framework that would allow access to abortion care. So I thought I understood what our state law was and the kind of care that someone in a situation like mine might be able to access. So, just floored on a personal level, but also on a policy level. And I talked to my providers, and they were very supportive of the decision that I very quickly made, really without hesitation. But they couldn't help me. They, explained very empathetically that their hands were tied by our state law, but they would help me get care out of state. And so interestingly enough, they found me an appointment at the DuPont clinic in DC, and it was, several days out, and I was so anxious to secure this vital care that I found myself an appointment just a few days earlier at another clinic in the Metro DC area called the Care Clinic, where I got incredibly compassionate care from the late Dr. Leroy Carhart. And so it was just an incredibly, disorienting and raging process to learn that your child had been consigned to either death or a fate far worse than death, in my opinion, and then to be turned away by your doctors and told that we can't help you. Even though we want to help you, we can't help you. You're going to have to travel. So I was in the best possible position to seek care out of state. I have a wonderful partner. We have family nearby. We were able to leave our toddler with family, and we have a car, and we had access to savings, and we dropped everything and drove 500 miles from Boston to Bethesda, Maryland, to obtain that compassionate abortion care that my own doctors at one of the leading hospitals in the country, if not the world, could not provide me because of the constraints of our state law. And I learned a lot about, the decision-making process along the way. My hospital, after the fact, told me that they had a panel in place to determine which terminations after 24 weeks could be performed in-house. And despite the fact that my son's diagnosis was dismal and likely fatal, it did not meet the hospital's definition of a quote, lethal fetal anomaly, which, amounts to a staggeringly short list of qualifying diagnoses. And at the end of the day, I am immensely grateful for the diagnostic care that I received in Boston and for the compassionate abortion care I received out of state in Maryland. And I'm just incredibly fortunate that I had the financial resources and the support system to travel out of state, to pay upwards of $10,000 out of pocket for medical expenses and travel costs. And many other patients simply don't have that luxury. So when I came back from DC, I started to share my story publicly here in Boston. I started to work with organizations like Reproductive Equity Now and lawmakers who were really surprised that patients were still being denied care in Massachusetts. I kind of got this overwhelming response of like, whoa, we thought we fixed this in 2020 with the Roe Act on the state level, which was really designed to codify Roe in the state constitution. But we all, learned together that a ban with exceptions often just functions as a ban. And in 2022, after the Dobbs leak, I had the opportunity to work with advocates and lawmakers here in Massachusetts to revisit the statutory language of the Roe Act and to try and clarify some of that exceptions framework. It was clear to me at the time that we didn't have a real shot at doing away with the gestational ban altogether. So we were really forced to kind of tinker around the margins and expand the exceptions framework, and ended up with some compromise language that does represent important progress toward realizing a future without forced travel or forced birth. And I'm really grateful for the leadership of the House and the Senate in Massachusetts to try and make some clarifying changes to our state law in 2022. So now we still have, fast forward to 2025, we still have a 24-week ban on the books, now with more expansive exceptions. So in addition to the lethal fetal anomaly provision that my son's case did not qualify for, there is now a grave fetal diagnosis provision. And we do know that is allowing certain patients to receive care in state who would have previously been forced to travel. However, we know that patients are still being denied care and forced to attempt to travel out of state. Now, during, of course, a time of a lot of legal uncertainty, a time of scarce resources where our abortion funds that often provide resources for folks traveling out of state are strained, where incredible all-trimester clinics like the DuPont clinic have constraints and, obviously limited openings. And what we're trying to do now here in Massachusetts is to revisit our state law again and to try and do away with that 24-week gestational ban altogether so that we can untie the hands of our world-class medical providers here in Massachusetts and allow them to provide the compassionate care to their patients that, by and large, they want to provide, so that patients are able to get care in state. They're not forced to attempt to travel, which we know many people just cannot travel for many reasons. And from my perspective as a later abortion patient who was forced to travel, I think that we in Massachusetts have a real moral imperative right now to expand access to abortion care throughout pregnancy and stop straining this very fragile network of abortion funds and this vital network of all-trimester clinics, and really commit to being a bastion for reproductive justice and commit to changing our state law so that the decision around moving forward with a pregnancy is one between the patient and their provider.
Kate, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate you doing that. And I think Kate's story really illustrates the limitations of exceptions. And Jeanette, maybe you can talk a little bit about exceptions and why they're just not enough.
Absolutely. So first of all, overall, the idea of exceptions to gestational age limits does perpetuate this anti-abortion argument that some individuals are more deserving of abortion care than others. We also see exceptions that are vaguely worded. Kind of like Kate was saying, they're not incredibly clear even when you do have the opportunity to go back and add to these exceptions or rework these exceptions. The wording of exceptions may create confusion among providers and patients who are concerned about violating the law, which does have a chilling effect on patients' ability to seek abortions, as well as providers' ability to provide abortion care to these patients. We see patients who come from out of state, including Massachusetts, who are terminating a pregnancy and they did not qualify for an exception or were not able to get an exception. And we can see that in some ways, the decision making as to who is able to get an exception can be subjective, again, just due to this vaguely worded statutory language. Abortion seekers may think that they do need to carry a pregnancy to term because they don't know that they have any options. They may have a provider who is not able to give them those options or not willing to give them those options, which is something that we do see, unfortunately. Another factor is that exceptions cause delays to care. Applying for and being granted an exception can take time. It can take weeks. And at that point, the pregnancy is further along. Patients are at a higher gestational age by the time they are able to get a procedure, even if they are granted an exception. And one of the things that we do see is the potential for increased risk for patients with a complex medical history if they are at a higher gestational age. Like Kate was saying, there are abortion seekers who are forced to travel out of state for care because they are not granted these exceptions. We see an increased procedure cost as a patient is further along in their pregnancy, as well as increased logistical barriers. So procedures can be anywhere from 1 to 4 days, depending on the clinic and depending on gestational age. Logistically, this means that a patient who is seeking an abortion needs to find childcare for multiple days. They need to take off from work for multiple days or take time off from school for multiple days. And this can have a serious effect on their life. They may have to deal with lost wages. They may have to reach out to family or friends who are unsupportive for childcare. And in that, we see a lot of inequity and disparity in access. Exceptions disproportionately, overwhelmingly affect marginalized communities who may already have limited access to healthcare. And they contribute to pre-existing healthcare inequities. Because abortion care is healthcare, and individuals have a right to seek that care without worrying about gestational age limits or having to apply for an exception and having to speak with a panel of doctors or a single doctor who makes the decision as to whether or not that pregnancy is harmful to their physical or mental health, whether a fetal anomaly is grave enough to warrant an abortion over 24 weeks in gestation, whether the fetal anomaly is lethal. We see a lot of exceptions in red states, but they can happen in blue states like Massachusetts as well. The goal is to, like Kate is doing, like people Kate is working with are doing, the goal is to improve access, increase access for patients all over the state and for patients in neighboring states who may want to travel to Massachusetts for abortion care.
I really love that you called out what this is all about is the perpetuation of that there are good abortions and bad abortions, and not just that this is healthcare that people need access to, because I think it is just so important that people kind of shift their mindset, because I think sometimes they hear gestational bans and they don't think through all of the reasons people may need an abortion later in pregnancy. They don't think about being in that position and needing access to the healthcare and not being able to get it until they are in that position. Okay, Kate, do you want to tell us a little bit about the campaign that is going on in Massachusetts right now to try and get rid of their gestational ban?
I would love to. And I'm just so grateful to be speaking with you both and appreciate the perspective of the DuPont clinic and Jeanette's leadership. Like it is just so amazing to hear, Jeanette, you speak about the issue. And, you know, every day you're showing up for patients who've been denied care all over the country. And, you know, I just really reflect upon the fact that I am one of the lucky ones. I had the resources and wherewithal to travel and to seek care out of state. And the alternative for me was one of just frankly government mandated forced birth, right, in Massachusetts, really, really plainly stated. And so, you know, I just continue to think about the patients who may not be able to travel, may not know what options exist for them. So just thank you for all that you're doing to make people aware that there are still options out there for them, regardless of where they live. So just thank you. But I would be delighted to talk more about what we're doing right now in Massachusetts to try and expand access to care throughout pregnancy. So working in partnership with some leaders in both the state Senate and the House, we are advocating for a piece of legislation called the Prioritizing Patient Access to Care Act that is being sponsored by State Senator Robin Kennedy and state reps Christine Barber and Lindsay Sabadosa here in Massachusetts. They're all champions, true champions for reproductive justice, and you really understand what's at stake if we are not able to act and we really just maintain the status quo. So what this bill would do is to expand access after 24 weeks of pregnancy when in the best professional judgment of a licensed physician. And this bill is loosely modeled after legislation that passed in Maine just in 2023, which is kind of an interesting model and an interesting test case politically in terms of red states, blue states, and purple states. Really, Maine was able to make some substantial progress back in 2023. And I think we want to kind of learn from that as a state and really upend the current status quo, which of course is a ban with now more expansive exceptions. And the intent is really simple. The goal is to enable doctors to give their patients the best medical care possible without government interference. And I often think that when we talk about good abortions versus bad abortions, or number of weeks of gestation, or the specifics of qualifying diagnoses, we really overcomplicate the issue. It's really about who decides. Is it the government? Is it a politician? Or is it the patient and their healthcare provider? And so our goal here is really to remove politics from the exam room. And at no point in pregnancy is a politician who writes a law more qualified to make decisions about abortion than a patient and their doctor. So it's really that simple, just framing it as a healthcare decision that should be guided by medicine and science and not by political opinion or really arbitrary statutes and arbitrary viability or gestational cutoffs. And we really just firmly believe that no patient should have to leave Massachusetts for care. And we know that that is still happening with some degree of regularity. I am personally aware of several cases just in the past month or so, having connected with patients who went through very similar experiences that I did. And just knowing that they have lived through the same trauma that I have is heartbreaking. And it's also really profoundly motivating to try and change the way that our state law is structured here in Massachusetts. There are some encouraging trends in public opinion polling, including polls that have been conducted here recently in Massachusetts. What we're seeing is that expanding access to abortion is popular. Massachusetts residents are really demanding that our Commonwealth continue to be a beacon for care. And especially as now we have with Trump in office and tremendous amount of uncertainty about what's happening at the federal level. So according to some recent polling conducted by Reproductive Equity Now's Foundation and EMC Research, 2 out of 3 Massachusetts voters support expanding access to abortion later in pregnancy based on the professional judgment of a physician. So those are really encouraging polling results. Again, we don't think policy should be directly influenced by public opinion. However, that public opinion trajectory is really encouraging, that people are starting to understand that it's really not about number of weeks. It's not about specific fetal diagnosis or specific life circumstance to sort out what abortions are good or bad. It's about who decides, the patient or the politician. And I think Americans across the country, not just here in Massachusetts, are becoming increasingly wary of government interference. And our hope here is that we can really leverage that to make some smart, common sense changes to our own state law here. And, in doing that, we're trying to sort through some of the stigma and some of the misinformation that's out there. We are trying to reinforce that abortion later in pregnancy is not done for convenience. I think that is a common talking point of the antis, and we even saw that trotted out on the presidential debate stage when we have politicians talking about so-called late-term abortion or so-called partial birth abortion or infanticide. The reality is abortions later in pregnancy are not done for convenience. They're serious medical procedures, in my case, often necessary due to unexpected complications, but also due to changing life circumstances, right? So it's not just about stories like mine where it was a devastating fetal diagnosis identified later in pregnancy. There are a variety of reasons why someone may need to or want to pursue an abortion later in pregnancy. And I would argue that those reasons are all deeply personal, not the government's business, and they're all valid. So our hope is to expand access to care throughout pregnancy and really ensure that patients and doctors, who are the ones carefully considering these decisions, can prioritize health, safety, and really lead with compassion for patients who are grappling with really challenging circumstances across the board. So, something that you said earlier really resonated with me around good versus bad abortions. And for me, as a later abortion patient, when I tell my story, I really wrestle with that because I find that most people hear a story like mine, a sad story of a mom trying to have another baby and really being confronted with this unexpected, devastating fetal diagnosis. I think my story is often met by a tremendous amount of empathy. And people say, oh, yes, well, your case is sad enough. You should have been able to qualify for an exception. But that's not what this is all about, right? It's not about carving out more exceptions. It's not about tinkering around the edges of statutory language. It's really about protecting healthcare decisions, keeping politicians out of our exam rooms, and allowing patients and providers to make informed decisions together without government interference. And so that stigma is very much still with us, even I think in the pro-choice movement. And so it's something, as a storyteller who has an arguably sad story, I think it's really important for people like me to affirm that you shouldn't need a sad story to be able to access abortion later in pregnancy.
Yeah. All I could think of as you were talking is had Dr. Diane Horvath on the podcast. I don't know, feels like forever ago, like time has no meaning anymore, but something she said that just made it so crystal clear as at what point in a person's pregnancy is the state more qualified to make a decision about your pregnancy than you are with your doctor. And that's the bottom line, right?
Yes.
There is no point where the state could ever institute enough exceptions to take into account people's reality or the world they live in to ensure that everybody who needs an abortion can get one. And it is, again, just ensuring access to basic health care, no matter someone's circumstance, to ensure that they are able to get the care that they need. Jeanette, you started to kind of allude to this when you were talking earlier, but what would it mean to get rid of that gestational ban in Massachusetts for access to care, not only in Massachusetts, but for the region?
Getting rid of the gestational ban would absolutely increase access to care, not just for people in Massachusetts, but for people in the surrounding states or even in the tri-state area. It would increase equity. People who may not otherwise be able to access healthcare will be able to access healthcare in their home state or in a state closer to them. And again, we see how this disproportionately affects marginalized communities that may already be dealing with systemic oppression, systemic racism, and may not have the same resources that other individuals do. And Kate really touched on this. And Kate, I appreciate you acknowledging that you were able to cover the cost of a procedure and travel, because there are a lot of individuals who aren't able to do that, which, again, I appreciate you acknowledging that. Absolutely. Right now, abortion funds and practical support organizations are really the backbone of all trimester care. They are making sure that individuals are able to pay for procedures. They're making sure that individuals are able to get to appointments. But there is a finite amount of resources. If individuals are able to get care closer to home, then it's going to be less costly for these organizations. They're going to be able to help more people rather than just one person at a higher gestational age with a larger procedure cost. And one last thing that I wanted to say is that patients don't owe us their stories. It is not our decision as to whether or not a patient deserves abortion care. We never ask a patient their reason. Sometimes patients disclose, and that is fine. But it's not necessary that a patient discloses why they are getting an abortion. There is no wrong reason to get an abortion.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I think about as you're talking about that is people being able to get care closer to where they live. And that means maybe less people from Massachusetts or the Northeast need to come to the DuPont clinic, and that frees you up to see other patients. I know there are so few all trimester clinics that getting an appointment can sometimes be a little complicated. So more clinics or more places where people can get access to the care helps alleviate the burden on the overall system to ensure that as many people as possible are able to access the care they need. Okay, I always like to end our conversations thinking about how the audience can get involved and what the audience can do. So let's go to Kate first. Kate, what are your thoughts of how our audience can get involved in this?
Well, first of all, I just have to tell Jeanette that when she said patients don't owe us our stories, I screamed, hell yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you for saying that. So there are a lot of great ways for folks to get involved. Here in Massachusetts, you could go to Reproductive Equity Now's website. It's reproequitynow.org/MA agenda, Mass Agenda. And there's an overview there of our broader 2025-2026 Massachusetts legislative agenda. And there is a Take Action page where you can click Learn More and take action on the bill called Expanding Abortion Access Throughout Pregnancy. And there's some really great data points and fact sheets, and you can click through the website to take action by writing to your legislator. You can take action by sharing your own story in any way you feel comfortable, posting to social media, writing a letter to the editor, signing up for volunteer trainings. And if you are from an organization that is either based in Massachusetts or New England or nationally, and you might be interested in offering your endorsement of this legislative approach, you can find information about that on the website as well.
Contact your state representative. Tell them that this is an issue that is important to you and an issue that is important to individuals, their constituents who are able to get pregnant. Be vocal in your support of the repeal of a gestational age ban. It is okay to talk about second and third trimester abortion care. It's something that people don't discuss as much. There's this stigma surrounding second and third trimester abortion care, and people are very quiet when it comes to that type of care. So please continue to discuss it, help eliminate that stigma. Volunteer at your local clinic or your local abortion fund or practical support organization. And absolutely donate to national and local abortion funds and practical support organizations. Many of these organizations are also involved in policy work and grassroots organizing. They are frequently the first people that patients talk to, and they do have a very good understanding of the general climate and the way that patients are approaching getting abortions and any concerns that the patients may have. Specifically for Massachusetts, just to plug them, funds Abortion Rights Fund of Western Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts Abortion Fund, and Tides for Reproductive Freedom. Those are all amazing organizations that we work with at DuPont Clinic and that are able and are helping multiple individuals who are from Massachusetts and have to travel outside Massachusetts for care.
And then I think I would just add one thing, and it's if you are unsure if your state has an abortion, a gestational ban, rePROs Fight Back created a report card that came out, this year's one came out in March. And if you go to the link we'll have in our show notes, but it's reprosfightback.com. You'll see the overall grade map, but there are toggles on the side, and you can click on abortion restrictions, and you can see which restrictions your state has, and included in that as gestational bans. You may be surprised in some of the states like Massachusetts, where you assume there wouldn't be those gestational bans, that your state may have one. So it's a really great resource to see how your state is faring when it comes to a whole slew of issues, but related to today, gestational bans.
Jeanette, I'm sorry. I actually thought of another way people could get involved too.
Awesome.
So I would challenge folks to question their own assumptions about abortion later in pregnancy and try and confront any internal stigma you have. And there are some really great resources out there. One that I find indispensable is a website called whonotwhen.com. And it's a project by Patient Forward, an incredible organization. And the website is really helpful in just breaking down what do we mean by abortion later in pregnancy? Why would people need abortion care later in pregnancy? Why are gestational bans harmful and to whom? What is this legal construct of fetal viability that was codified in Roe? And why is that a bad legal construct? So there are wonderful resources out there. So if you want to learn more about why people seek care later in pregnancy and why gestational or viability bans are so deeply harmful and do not result in people being able to access care, please check out whonotwhen.com. There are other great resources linked on there too. And I think there is a misconception out there held by a lot of folks, including a lot of pro-choice or even pro-abortion people, that this construct of a 24-week ban with exceptions is a reasonable compromise, is a moderate compromise. And I would just encourage people to sit with the reality of that ban and exception construct. That really means that if you're a pregnant person in Massachusetts and your pregnancy crosses this arbitrary point of, quote, fetal viability at 24 weeks, then you are, in most cases, a government-mandated incubator. You cannot legally get care in Massachusetts, and you are on your own to try and find care out of state if you can do it. If you can figure out those logistics, if you can cobble together the money and the wherewithal to travel 500 miles out of state with little or no support, Godspeed. That's the reality in many of these blue states, and it's a very uncomfortable reality. I think that some people are uncomfortable with the concept of an abortion later in pregnancy, due in part to the really effective propaganda that's been perpetuated by the anti-choice movement for decades. And I would challenge people to also acknowledge how deeply uncomfortable and I would say unjust this current statutory framework is of forced birth. And in the best case scenario, forced travel, right? Again, I am so lucky at the end of the day to have been able to seek care out of state. And the alternatives for me would have been dire, both to my physical and mental health, and overall to my self-determination as a person who should be able to decide what to do with my body and my healthcare and my family at any point. So to go back to Dr. Horvath's own words, at what point in pregnancy is a politician or the state or the government better able to make a decision? And I think we would say never. So just, thank you for digging into this topic that I think is often neglected and is often one people would rather not think about. But it is, I think, increasingly important in a national landscape where we know, as Jeanette said earlier, that bans at any point are forcing people later and later in pregnancy. Bans at any point are forcing people to seek care later and later in pregnancy. So we're going to be, and I think we already are seeing more and more cases of second and third trimester abortions because folks may not have had the ability to get an abortion earlier in pregnancy too.
I really love that you talked about challenging that internalized abortion stigma, because there is so much abortion stigma that is you just absorb from the world around you, just that is in the media and in the news and all of the places. I went to Catholic school. I had sex ed from a nun. I had a lot to work through, and I'm sure there are still parts that I am still trying to root out, but it is important to recognize where it exists in the way you are thinking about these things and to try and challenge it and get rid of it. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Oh, and we will hear from the Catholic Church in Massachusetts, no doubt.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure they have thoughts.
Yes, always on any action. In fact, they even oppose the incremental changes that we made to the exceptions framework back in 2022. So opposition at every turn, and very well-funded opposition and well-connected opposition. So it's never not a battle.
Kate, Jeanette, thank you so much for being here today. I had so much fun talking to y'all about abortion later in pregnancy.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for all that you do.
Okay, y'all, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jeanette and Kate. Like I said, I am really loving doing this series. We are halfway through. I'm excited for our next conversations. With that, I will see everybody next week. If you have any questions, comments, or topics you would like us to cover, always feel free to shoot me an email. You can reach me at Jennie, Jennie, at reprosfightback.com, or you can find us on social media. We're at Repros Fight Back on Facebook and Twitter, or Repros FB on Instagram. If you love our podcast and want to make sure more people find it, take the time to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Or if you want to make sure to support the podcast, you can also donate on our website at reprosfightback.com. Thanks all.